Harriet Mansfield had only meant to grab a quick latte and get on with her day in downtown Atlanta. Yet, within minutes, her life would unravel in ways she could never have imagined. Driven by prejudice, she dialed 911 on a complete stranger, Jasmine Owens, whose only crime was standing in the same coffee shop line. What Harriet never expected was that Jasmine was no ordinary citizen. She was a CIA agent with a hidden mission. The aftermath of Harriet's hasty call would spark a roller coaster of shocking revelations, legal showdowns, and one of the most dramatic "you'll regret this" moments the city had ever seen. Harriet Mansfield was a 50-year-old woman who often found comfort in routines and familiarity. She lived in a tidy Victorian-style home in Buckhead, an affluent neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia. Each morning, she rose at precisely 6:15 a.m., let her dog, Tucker, out for a short walk, then had exactly one slice of toast with a generous dollop of strawberry jam. She had done so for years, seldom questioning the monotony she seemed to relish. Harriet believed strongly in rules, order, and decorum. She also believed that people who didn't belong had to be kept in check. This mindset had festered in her over the years, turning into something far uglier than simple caution: veiled racism. Despite her place in a culturally diverse city, Harriet managed to surround herself with people who thought like she did. Her circle of friends wasn't large, but it was a tight-knit group of ladies from the local country club who often met for weekend brunches, sipping mimosas and exchanging quick quips about whoever wasn't present to defend themselves. Their idea of a crisis was the country club running out of Cointreau or a new neighbor letting the lawn grow too tall. But beneath her rigid manners, Harriet held silent resentments. She remembered her father, a retired police officer, telling her in her teenage years, "You've got to stay vigilant in this world, Harriet. Some people aren't like us." She had taken those words to heart, applying them with a brush broad enough to justify suspicion of anyone who looked, spoke, or acted differently from her. When Harriet ventured outside her usual confines, her anxiety spiked. City life in downtown Atlanta teemed with faces from every background. Though Harriet never said it out loud, part of her always felt threatened when she stepped outside Buckhead's tidy boundaries. She told herself it was prudent fear, a self-defense mechanism in a world growing more chaotic. She didn't see it for what it really was: prejudice that ran so deep she could hardly function without leaning on it. On the fateful morning that set everything in motion, Harriet decided to leave Buckhead to visit the brand new Starbucks on Peachtree Street, an anomaly in her routine. Normally, she would have stuck to her local coffee spot, but her nephew had recommended the new Starbucks as having some special seasonal beverage she just had to try. Curiosity piqued, Harriet maneuvered her pearl-white Lexus through traffic, mentally congratulating herself on her willingness to be adventurous for a change. As she found parking in a busy lot downtown, Harriet felt her comfort bubble begin to shrink. People passed by in a hurried blur, some in business suits, others in casual attire. The sidewalks bustled with tourists snapping photos of the city's skyscrapers. Students from Georgia State University wove in and out of shops, chattering with excitement as they rushed to morning lectures. The swirl of activity was overwhelming. She kept her sunglasses on as she walked, clutching her handbag a little tighter whenever someone passed too close. She felt relieved when she finally saw the familiar green Starbucks logo. This was territory she understood: lines, a menu, and polite baristas. She only had to get her coffee, maybe find a small table by the window, and wait for her nephew to join her. Inside, Harriet exhaled a breath she'd been holding. Sure, it was crowded, but the hum of the espresso machines and the aroma of roasted beans were comforting. She stepped into the queue, eyeing the chalkboard menu. Her nephew had suggested a salted caramel mocha, something Harriet wasn't used to but felt an urge to try. She decided she'd order it, even if it did feel a bit too sweet. Then she noticed the woman standing in line just ahead of her, a tall, poised black woman wearing an immaculate navy blue blazer, black slacks, and sleek low heels. The woman's hair was styled in a neat twist, and she balanced her phone in one hand while checking something on a notepad in the other. Harriet observed how calmly she stood, how confident she appeared. Something about that woman's composure made Harriet uneasy. She instinctively shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Just as Harriet's mind began to wander, wondering why the woman was so intensely focused on her phone, a gentle voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Excuse me," the woman said, stepping aside so Harriet could edge past if she needed more space. Harriet blinked, muttered a quick sorry, and resumed her position. But she was on high alert, a drumbeat of anxious distrust thrumming in her chest. Jasmine Owens had endured an intense week. She was a high-level CIA operative stationed at the agency's headquarters in Langley, Virginia, but on this particular mission, she found herself in Atlanta. The assignment was covert, of course. Most of her colleagues weren't even aware of its specifics. It involved an international narcotics syndicate believed to be funneling illegal profits through local businesses. Jasmine's expertise in financial tracking made her the perfect agent for the job. Growing up in a middle-class neighborhood in Chicago, Jasmine had learned early on how to adapt and thrive. Her parents, both educators, instilled in her a strong sense of justice and the importance of humility. She excelled in school, and after graduating from Loyola University Chicago with honors in political science, she had her pick of law schools. But Jasmine chose a different path, one that aligned with her desire to serve her country and combat bigger threats to society. She joined the CIA. In her early years at Langley, Jasmine often felt the challenges of being a black woman in a realm still dominated by men, often white men from established networks. Yet, Jasmine's confidence and clear-headed focus earned her respect among her peers. Superiors recognized her unique talent for analytical problem-solving, her nerve under pressure, and her extraordinary ability to blend into varied social settings. She rose rapidly through the ranks, eventually landing critical missions. Her current operation in Atlanta required her to blend in as a financial consultant. On the surface, Jasmine dressed the part perfectly: navy blazer, well-pressed slacks, and a matching purse that looked professional without drawing undue attention. Beneath that facade, she was carrying a discreet sidearm, standard CIA issue for emergencies. She also had a phone loaded with specialized software for encryption and communication with her immediate superior. Officially, Jasmine's employer was Hastings and Brooks Consulting, a plausible front for her intelligence work. On that Friday morning, Jasmine's schedule involved meeting a contact at a busy Starbucks on Peachtree Street. The coffee shop was a perfect rendezvous point where it was easy to blend into the crowd. She needed to finalize details about which local businesses the cartel might be using for money laundering. Jasmine woke early at her hotel, reviewing the mission details with her usual diligence. She never liked rushing, preferring instead to walk into any meeting with composure and awareness of her surroundings. Upon entering the Starbucks, Jasmine spotted a short line. Good, she thought. It would give her time to order coffee and quickly text the contact. She fished her phone out, swiftly checking the encrypted messaging app for any update from her partner. Then she scribbled notes in a small notepad she used for seemingly mundane details, just to keep up the appearance of a busy consultant. Occasionally, Jasmine glanced around, a habit she had developed from years of training. She noticed the middle-aged white woman behind her almost immediately. The woman seemed tense. Jasmine mentally cataloged the details: the structured bob haircut, the crisp pastel blouse, the stiff posture. Jasmine didn't like jumping to conclusions, but something about the woman's barely contained anxiety made Jasmine cautious. Was she just a nervous bystander, or could she be involved somehow? Jasmine dismissed the notion that Harriet was part of her assignment. Most likely, the older woman was simply uncomfortable in a busy city environment. Still, Jasmine took care not to invade Harriet's personal space. When she noticed Harriet looked cramped behind her, Jasmine politely stepped aside to give her more room. She was trying to project an air of neutrality, nothing to arouse suspicion or hostility. She kept her phone angled so no one could see the specialized app. After all, no one in that Starbucks needed to know Jasmine's real business there. But Harriet's reaction was peculiar. She apologized but darted her eyes away as though Jasmine was causing her some kind of alarm. Jasmine forced a polite smile, thinking, maybe she's just having a bad day. People in line for coffee often showed signs of impatience or anxiety. Jasmine returned her focus to the message from her contact, a quick note confirming that the meeting was set for 10:30 a.m. at a co-working space 3 blocks away. She'd have enough time to grab her coffee, finalize notes, and walk over to meet the informant. Yet, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that Harriet's discomfort was something more personal. She sensed the older woman's body language, rigid, arms drawn close, as though preparing for a confrontation she believed might happen at any moment. It was the kind of posture Jasmine had seen in countless field assignments, usually from people who disliked or distrusted her without basis. Jasmine silently reminded herself, "Stay cool. Don't assume the worst." She could be anxious about something else entirely. The line progressed slowly, and Jasmine inched forward along with Harriet. Jasmine ordered a tall Pike Place roast, black, no sugar, and decided to wait nearby for her drink. Harriet, after glancing uncomfortably at the menu boards, ended up ordering the salted caramel mocha her nephew had recommended. Jasmine stepped aside to let Harriet place her order, careful to keep a polite distance to avoid flustering the woman further. But Harriet was still watching Jasmine out of the corner of her eye, a gnawing sense of suspicion growing with each passing moment. She told herself that it was Jasmine's phone usage that made her uneasy. Why was she typing so furtively? Harriet latched on to any rationale she could to justify her discomfort. Perhaps she's scoping out the place, Harriet thought, or planning something. She looks too confident, too poised. To Harriet's mind, Jasmine did not look like a typical office worker. That blazer is too crisp, her posture too military-like straight. Harriet's internal monologue ran, unfounded though it was. Harriet's suspicion mushroomed into paranoia. She felt a wave of adrenaline and glanced around, seeking eye contact with someone, anyone, who might share her concerns. But nobody seemed to notice Jasmine as a threat. After placing her order, Harriet retreated to a small table by the window. She took out her phone, an older model with a screen protector that had seen better days. She scrolled through social media but couldn't focus on anything. Her eyes kept darting to Jasmine, who was now standing near the pickup counter, calmly scrolling through her phone. Harriet's heart pounded. She was convinced something was off, and Harriet had learned from her father's stories. When you see something suspicious, act on it. It was then that Harriet noticed Jasmine exchanging a quick glance with another man in the Starbucks. He was just a local real estate agent waiting for his cappuccino, unbeknownst to Harriet, but in her mind, it became a piece of evidence. Jasmine and this man were in cahoots. What if they're planning a robbery or a scam or something worse? By the time Harriet's salted caramel mocha arrived, she was sweating. She grabbed the drink, took one sip, and barely tasted its sweet richness. She set the cup down, rummaging through her purse. She brushed past her contact list, hesitating before making a call to 911. She whispered to herself, "Better safe than sorry." Her father's voice echoed in her memory, fueling her resolve. She tapped the 3 digits. On the other end, an operator answered, 911. "What's your emergency?" Harriet's voice quivered slightly. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person at the Starbucks on Peachtree Street. She's acting very strange," whispering on her phone, looking around like she's up to something. "I think she might be dangerous." The operator asked for a description, and Harriet gave Jasmine's approximate height, complexion, and clothing. She chose her words carefully, emphasizing Jasmine's race. She's a tall African-American woman, about mid-30s or so, wearing a navy blazer and black slacks. She's been looking at people and typing on her phone a lot. She seems threatening. Harriet's paranoia was so strong, she was convinced of the truth of her statement. Once she ended the call, Harriet's palms felt clammy. A surge of self-righteous adrenaline coursed through her. She truly believed she was preventing a potential crime, helping the community stay safe. She cast another glance at Jasmine, who was calmly collecting her black coffee from the barista. Jasmine gave a friendly smile to the barista, who had complimented her shoes. Then Jasmine started walking toward the exit. Harriet leapt to her feet, nearly knocking over her own coffee. She didn't want Jasmine to slip away before the authorities arrived. She hastily grabbed her purse, leaving the mocha half-drunk on the table. Without subtlety, Harriet followed Jasmine out the door, trying to act nonchalant, but failing miserably. Jasmine, oblivious, was already stepping onto the busy sidewalk. Heart pounding, Harriet pressed herself against the outside wall, keeping Jasmine in sight. She dialed 911 again, breathless. "She's leaving now," Harriet hissed into the phone. "She's headed south on Peachtree. Please hurry." The operator assured her officers were en route. Harriet's stomach churned with a mixture of dread and exhilaration. She believed she was doing her civic duty. She believed she was, in some twisted sense, a hero. Meanwhile, Jasmine walked along the sidewalk, checking the time on her phone. Her meeting was in 20 minutes, a short walk away. She was mentally rehearsing what she would say to the informant, how she'd piece together the final puzzle in this money laundering operation. The swirl of Starbucks customers and city dwellers behind her was the last thing on her mind. Then came the sirens. Jasmine froze for a moment, noticing the sound of approaching police vehicles. Curiosity made her pause. She turned just in time to see two patrol cars pull up to the curb. Officers quickly exited, scanning the crowd. Harriet, from her vantage point by the Starbucks window, waved her arms to get their attention, pointing frantically at Jasmine. Jasmine's brows furrowed in confusion. Suddenly, the officers converged on Jasmine, hands hovering near their holsters. "Ma'am, please step aside and show us your hands," one of them demanded in a tense voice. Jasmine complied immediately, her heart thudding. She raised her hands, her coffee cup still in her grasp. Shock and indignation flashed across her face. She spoke calmly. "Officers, what's going on?" The officers exchanged a glance. They had no choice but to respond to the reported threat, though Jasmine hardly looked threatening. Harriet rushed over, her voice shrill. "That's her. She was acting so suspicious. I had to call you. I think she might be dangerous." Confusion turned to realization for Jasmine. She noticed Harriet's tense posture, the fear in her eyes. Jasmine took a measured breath and tried to speak rationally. "Ma'am, I can assure you there's been a misunderstanding." But her words fell on deaf ears. One of the officers, following standard protocol, told Jasmine to place her hands behind her back. Another officer began to pat her down, eyes narrowing when he felt something at her waist, her concealed sidearm. "We've got a weapon," the officer shouted, pulling Jasmine's gun out of its holster. Jasmine immediately identified herself as a federal agent, but in the confusion, the officers didn't process it. They had incomplete information and a frightened civilian pointing to Jasmine as a threat. Within seconds, Jasmine's arms were pinned, and the officers were cuffing her. The passers-by gawked, smartphones emerging to capture the sudden frenzy. Harriet stood to the side, her face flushed with a strange mixture of triumph and fear. Jasmine maintained her composure as much as possible. "I'm a CIA agent," she tried to clarify. "I have credentials in my blazer pocket." But the officers were running on adrenaline. One of them rifled through Jasmine's pocket, retrieving a wallet with her official identification. Everything paused. The officer studied the ID carefully, blinking hard. He gave his partner a look that blended alarm and uncertainty. Meanwhile, Jasmine stood there, trying to keep her voice calm. "My name is Jasmine Owens, CIA. I'm on official business in Atlanta. That sidearm is legal and registered." She eyed Harriet with a controlled glare. This woman called the cops on me for no reason, Jasmine thought. And now she's about to cause more problems than she realizes. The initial shock among the officers was palpable. They exchanged glances that flickered between disbelief and concern. The older of the two officers, Sergeant Boyd, spoke first. "Let's see your badge more closely, ma'am. If you're truly CIA, you're aware of how serious this is." He removed Jasmine's CIA identification card from the wallet. The credentials were legitimate, featuring Jasmine's photograph, a serial number, and official holographic elements. After verifying it, the color drained from Sergeant Boyd's face. Meanwhile, Harriet stood there, her mouth agape. She had expected the officers to cart Jasmine away, not to pause and treat her with a newfound caution. Harriet's heart pounded as she tried to piece together what was happening. CIA? This woman is CIA. Harriet's mind spun, dread creeping up her spine. "Are you sure this ID is legit?" asked the younger officer, Officer Kim. Jasmine nodded, and with a calm that belied her anger, she repeated, "I'm Jasmine Owens, a CIA agent working in Atlanta under a covert assignment. If you check with headquarters, or even the ID in your system, you'll confirm everything. I don't appreciate being tackled or having my weapon confiscated without any probable cause." Sergeant Boyd's demeanor shifted from the aggression of a police intervention to measured respect tinged with embarrassment. "We got a call that you were acting suspicious," he said quietly. "We had to respond." Jasmine's eyes flicked to Harriet, who was now clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. Harriet's face betrayed shock, but Jasmine could also see the creeping recognition that she might have made a huge mistake. Jasmine faced the officers again. "Is there any reason to keep me in cuffs now that you see who I am and what I'm legally carrying?" Her voice was calm, but the tension in her tone was unmistakable. Sergeant Boyd quickly nodded to Officer Kim, who removed the handcuffs. Jasmine rubbed her wrists, grateful to be freed, but the sting of humiliation lingered. Pedestrians on the sidewalk still gawked, some filming. In an age of viral videos, Jasmine knew how quickly such an incident could spread online. She also knew how dangerous it was for a black woman, even one with CIA credentials, to be approached in such a manner, especially when some officers might act rashly. Harriet was still rattled. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice almost inaudible. Fear and guilt warred inside her, but her pride wouldn't allow a full apology. She coughed and managed. I saw you fiddling with your phone and looking around. I was worried." Jasmine's dark eyes locked on Harriet. She forced herself to maintain professional composure. "You assumed I was a criminal because I was looking at my phone in a coffee shop?" Jasmine asked in a measured tone. Harriet just stared down at her shoes, unable to form a coherent response. Jasmine turned to Sergeant Boyd. "I'm going to need a copy of the police report on this. I also want the name of the caller who made this report." "We'll have to file an official report," Sergeant Boyd said. "And we'll need your statement, Ms. Owens. As for the caller, that's public record. Her name is Harriet Mansfield." Jasmine filed the name away in her memory. She understood Harriet's type all too well: paranoid, prejudiced, and quick to weaponize law enforcement against innocent people of color. Jasmine had encountered this more times than she could count in her life, though never in such a dramatic public fashion. Even in her line of work, Jasmine rarely faced such blatant prejudice on the street. Covert missions often shielded her from random racism. Her colleagues respected her skill set, and criminals avoided her because they didn't suspect she was an agent. But Harriet's call was a different story. Unvarnished prejudice that could have ended in disaster had the officers been less professional or Jasmine been less poised. Returning her focus to the mission, Jasmine rechecked her watch. She was already late for her informant meeting. "I'll need my weapon back," Jasmine said, glancing at the younger officer who had confiscated it. He hesitated, then handed it over, handle first, after verifying Jasmine's identity again. Jasmine tucked it back into her concealed holster and smoothed her blazer, heart still hammering. A crowd had gathered, forming a ring of curious onlookers. Some recognized that the woman was a CIA agent, and a murmured hush fell over them. Others whispered heated comments about the dangers of racial profiling. Harriet's cheeks glowed as if she just walked out of a furnace. She wanted to disappear, to vanish among the throng of unsuspecting tourists. But Harriet's urge to double down wrestled with her dawning comprehension of the magnitude of her error. Even after returning Jasmine's credentials, Sergeant Boyd was required to ask Jasmine a few more questions. "Ms. Owens," he said gently, "I apologize for the inconvenience, but you know how these calls go. We have a duty to investigate. Can you confirm your immediate plans so we know this was just a false alarm?" "I have a meeting at a co-working space down the block," Jasmine said, giving him the name Industrious Peach Tree, a well-known co-working hub in downtown Atlanta. "If you need more details, my supervisor at Langley can provide them. I'll give you his name and contact if necessary." Sergeant Boyd took down some notes, satisfied there was no real threat. "I'll file this as unfounded suspicious activity," he said grimly. "Again, sorry for the trouble." Jasmine nodded coolly. She turned her attention back to Harriet, meeting the older woman's gaze. Harriet's eyes were brimming with conflicting emotions: fear, shame, stubbornness. "I'm late for my meeting," Jasmine said to Harriet, her words clipped. "But you and I will likely see each other again." Without waiting for Harriet's response, Jasmine merged with the foot traffic and hurried away, her composure intact but her mind spinning. She'd have to explain her lateness to her CIA contact, carefully emphasizing that it wouldn't compromise her mission. And Jasmine knew she wouldn't let this injustice slide. There was a moral and legal dimension to what Harriet had done. For Jasmine, this was more than just an inconvenience. It was a stark demonstration of the dangers of prejudice, and Harriet needed to be held accountable for filing a false police report. As Jasmine disappeared into the crowd, Harriet remained rooted to the sidewalk, oblivious to the stares from strangers. Her heart hammered in her chest, throbbing with regret and a creeping panic about what seeing each other again might entail. She looked at the police officers, who were now wrapping up their conversation. She took a shaky breath and approached Sergeant Boyd. "Is this going to be on record?" she asked in a voice that trembled. He gave her a look that was more pity than annoyance. "We have to write up everything," he said. "Your statement, the ID check, the reason for the call. Ms. Owens might decide to take legal steps if she feels you falsely reported a crime. That's not my decision to make. If you have questions, you can talk to a lawyer." The word lawyer fell on Harriet like a hammer blow. She felt faint. She couldn't afford an expensive legal battle. She was living on her late husband's pension and her modest inheritance. As the crowd began to disperse, Harriet slumped against the Starbucks window, her salted caramel mocha still sitting on the table inside, untouched. Jasmine's meeting with her informant at Industrious Peach Tree went smoothly. The contact, a soft-spoken accountant who had discovered suspicious transactions in his firm's books, handed over digital records. Jasmine confirmed these pointed to a cartel-backed entity. She spent the next few hours working from a private cubicle, uploading encrypted files to Langley and summarizing the evidence for her superiors. Through it all, her mind kept drifting to the jarring incident outside Starbucks. Anger simmered beneath her professional facade. She wanted to focus, but each time she closed her eyes, she felt the tightness of the handcuffs on her wrists again. Meanwhile, Harriet's evening was a study in guilt and panic. She sped home to Buckhead, nearly sideswiping a trash bin on the way. She could hardly concentrate on the traffic lights, her thoughts spiraling. She kept replaying the moment Jasmine revealed she was CI. Harriet felt sick, her mind conjuring scenarios where she was sued into bankruptcy, or, even worse, somehow found guilty of a criminal act. She arrived at her pristine Victorian home, but it no longer felt comforting. Everything seemed to suffocate her. She barely noticed Tucker barking at her from the doorway. Dropping her purse on the kitchen table, Harriet sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. She picked up her phone and dialed the only number she felt could offer some guidance. Her longtime friend Margaret, a retired paralegal. The phone rang several times before Margaret answered in a drowsy voice. Harriet had forgotten it was after 9 p.m. "Margaret, I messed up," Harriet blurted, her voice shaking. She recounted the entire humiliating episode, leaving out none of the unpleasant details. Margaret listened, occasionally making sympathetic noises. When Harriet finished, a long silence ensued. Finally, Margaret spoke, careful with her tone. "Harriet, this is serious. You lodged a false report if you had no real evidence to suspect that woman of a crime." "She was acting suspicious," Harriet insisted, tears welling up as her facade cracked. "I mean, she had a gun. She had a legal, registered weapon," Margaret corrected. "Look, you might be charged with making a false police report or face a civil suit for discrimination or defamation. People have successfully sued in these cases." Harriet's stomach dropped. She pictured a courtroom, Jasmine standing on one side with high-powered CIA attorneys, Harriet on the other with no real defense. "What do I do?" Harriet whispered. "I can't go to jail." Margaret tried to offer practical advice, talking about apologizing or writing Jasmine a letter, or even seeking legal counsel immediately. Harriet felt overwhelmed, but resolved to do something. She hated the idea of groveling, but this fear overshadowed her pride. She promised Margaret she'd think about next steps. For the first time in years, Harriet spent the night tossing and turning, replaying her father's words about vigilance and realizing how misguided she'd become. For days past, Jasmine and the CIA's legal counsel had been swift in their investigation. The local district attorney's office was also looped in because Jasmine decided to file a complaint for a false police report. There had been an uptick in racial profiling incidents nationally, and Jasmine's case had the additional weight of her being a federal agent on official duty. What Harriet didn't know was just how influential Jasmine could be when she chose to flex her connections. Jasmine's father, Daniel Owens, had once worked with the Department of Justice on civil rights enforcement. Though he was retired now, he still had friends in high places, including lawyers who specialized in cases exactly like Jasmine's. When Jasmine called him that weekend to explain what had happened, Daniel was livid and insisted on connecting her with his old colleagues. Jasmine appreciated her father's protective instincts, but she also wanted to ensure that any legal steps taken were measured, fair, and focused on accountability rather than revenge. Jasmine shared this information discreetly with the local district attorney, who found it concerning but not outright damning. The DA's office planned to bring Harriet in for questioning. They also made it clear that Jasmine was well within her rights to pursue a civil suit for the distress and risk Harriet had caused. Jasmine hadn't decided yet whether to go down that route. In her more compassionate moments, Jasmine felt Harriet might be more misguided than malicious. But Jasmine also understood that repeated acts of misguided prejudice had real-world consequences, particularly for Black communities who bore the brunt of such profiling. Meanwhile, Jasmine continued her primary CIA operation. She gathered enough evidence to implicate a local shell company in laundering cartel money. A federal sting was in the works, set to take place in the coming weeks. If Harriet only knew how close she'd come to blowing open a top-secret operation by interfering with Jasmine on that Starbucks sidewalk. Maybe she'll realize her biases have real consequences, Jasmine thought. It was on the 5th day after the Starbucks incident that Jasmine received a phone call she never expected. Harriet Mansfield's voice trembled on the line. "Ms. Owens," Harriet said cautiously, "I got your number from the police report. I'd like to speak with you. Is there any chance we can meet? Please." Jasmine's reaction was a blend of surprise and skepticism. She was tempted to reject Harriet outright, tell her to deal with the legal system. But curiosity tugged at Jasmine, along with an ingrained sense of justice that included hearing people out. "Why?" Jasmine asked simply. Harriet stammered. I feel terrible. I want to apologize, explain myself. I know that might not count for much now, but I want to make things right." Jasmine was silent for a long moment, measuring Harriet's voice for authenticity. She didn't hear contrition so much as desperation. But she relented. "Meet me at the same Starbucks tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., Jasmine said. "I'll give you 10 minutes of my time." Harriet exhaled shakily. "Thank you," she managed before the call ended. The night before the meeting, Harriet barely slept. She stared at the ceiling, the events of the past week swirling in her mind. She had officially been summoned to speak with the local DA's office in 2 days about her 911 call. Margaret had arranged for Harriet to consult a defense attorney, who quickly pointed out that Harriet had zero evidence to justify that call beyond her own hunch. Harriet faced the possibility of a misdemeanor charge for filing a false report, maybe even civil litigation. The attorney had strongly advised Harriet to demonstrate remorse and good faith by reaching out to Jasmine. Thus, Harriet found herself trembling in the same Starbucks the next morning, forcing herself to buy a grande black coffee she had no intention of drinking. She found a table near the back, away from the bustle. The building's exposed brick walls felt colder than before, and the aroma of coffee did little to soothe her nerves. She was sweating despite the mild autumn weather. She recalled how just a week ago she was savoring a salted caramel mocha and feeling, oh so confident, in her decision to call the authorities. At precisely 9 a.m., Jasmine walked in, wearing a dark green blouse and black pants. She looked as professional as ever, her posture erect, her eyes scanning the room. Harriet's stomach did a little flip-flop. She carries herself like someone with power, Harriet thought. She felt the gulf between them. Harriet, the civilian. Jasmine, the CIA operative. Harriet stood awkwardly, raising a hesitant hand in greeting. Jasmine approached with controlled grace. She said no pleasantries, merely sat down across from Harriet, meeting her gaze with a calm that spoke volumes. Harriet was the first to break the silence. "Thank you for coming. I know you're busy, important." Jasmine shrugged slightly. "Your call. What did you want to say?" Harriet swallowed. "I'm sorry. I realize I acted irrationally. I saw you and assumed." Her voice trailed off. Harriet felt the weight of Jasmine's silent scrutiny. She tried again. "I've been on edge for years. My father drilled into me that I should watch out for criminals, especially in parts of the city I'm not used to. I let that fear turn into something hateful. I genuinely thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now it was prejudice." Jasmine listened, her expression neutral. "And you think that makes it okay?" she asked softly. Harriet shook her head, tears threatening to surface. No, I don't think it's okay. That's why I'm here. I know you have every right to press charges, and I don't blame you. I want you to know how sorry I am. And I hope there's something I can do, some way to fix this, or at least make it better." A brief silence settled over the table. Jasmine considered Harriet, noticing the genuine tremor in her hands and the sheen of tears in her eyes. Jasmine had learned through her line of work how to read people. Harriet's fear was real, and her regret seemed genuine. But Jasmine also knew Harriet was motivated by the looming threat of legal consequences. Finally, Jasmine spoke. "Harriet, I'm not here to humiliate you, but what you did was more than just fear. You profiled me. You decided that a black woman in a coffee shop looking at her phone must be up to no good. You turned that assumption into a weapon, 911, and that could have ended very badly. I have years of training, but imagine you did that to someone else, someone who might react differently or who might not have the advantage of official credentials." Harriet lowered her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I know. I'm learning. I see now." She let out a shaky sigh. "I'm so ashamed." Jasmine leaned forward slightly. "Have you ever considered why you're so afraid, or tried to challenge that fear? You live in a city that's majority black, Harriet. If you can't handle that, Maybe you need to do some serious self-reflection. Harriet nodded, rubbing her eyes. She felt a wave of shame, recalling how her father's biases had become her own. You're right, she murmured, voice thick with emotion. I've never confronted it. Always just believed what my father said. I thought I was protecting myself. Now I see how destructive that is. They sat in silence for a moment. Jasmine could see Harriet's shoulders shaking. Despite the bitterness of the situation, Jasmine felt a fleeting sense of pity. Racism, she knew, could be taught and unlearned, but only if a person was willing to reckon with themselves. The DA wants to question you. My attorneys are also exploring a civil suit, Jasmine said evenly. Harriet nodded, wiping her tears with a tissue. Yes, I know. I'm going to meet with them. I'll say whatever I have to say. Jasmine took a measured breath. I want more than words. I want you to commit to some kind of tangible effort. Maybe volunteer with a civil rights organization or go through training about racial bias. You need to put in real work, Harriet, not just for me, but for anyone you might wrong in the future. Harriet nodded vigorously. Yes, I can do that. I will do that, she said, desperate for any path toward redemption. She recounted some ideas Margaret had given her about participating in community outreach programs. Harriet was far from certain about how to begin, but she wanted Jasmine to see her willingness. Though Jasmine remained cautious, she offered a tiny nod. All right, she said, standing up. If you follow through, maybe we can have a more meaningful conversation someday. For now, I suggest you focus on doing the right thing with the DA. If they decide to press charges, that's on them. I won't stand in their way. Harriet felt both relief and looming dread. Jasmine's words indicated she wasn't out for Harriet's total destruction, but it was clear Harriet was still in serious legal jeopardy. Before Jasmine turned to leave, Harriet blurted, Can you forgive me? Jasmine paused, her gaze unwavering. Forgiveness isn't automatic. It's earned, she said simply, then walked out of the Starbucks, leaving Harriet to stare after her. 2 weeks later, Harriet stood in the Fulton County Courthouse, heart thumping so loudly she was certain it echoed off the marble floors. She wore her best black pencil skirt and a conservative blouse. Her attorney, a stoic middle-aged man named Richard Hale, was by her side. The district attorney's office had moved swiftly, scheduling a preliminary hearing to determine if Harriet should be criminally charged with filing a false police report. If the judge found probable cause, Harriet would face a formal arraignment. The hallway buzzed with activity. Defense lawyers flipped through case notes. Somber-faced defendants slumped on benches. Family members waited anxiously. Harriet felt like she was in a slow-motion dream. No, not a dream, a nightmare. The air was stale, the fluorescent lighting harsh. She was used to the soft ambience of country clubs, not the stark reality of a courthouse. At precisely 9 a.m., they were called into a small courtroom. The judge, an African-American woman named Judge Monique Daniels, sat at a raised desk, her posture exuding authority. Harriet's stomach churned. She glimpsed Jasmine at a table with an assistant district attorney. Jasmine wore a sharp dark suit, and her eyes never wavered from Harriet. Harriet swallowed hard, a lump of guilt forming in her throat. The case was introduced. The assistant DA summarized Harriet's 911 call and Jasmine's subsequent detention. Jasmine's CIA status was mentioned, but not the specifics of her mission. The ADA made it clear Jasmine was in the right place at the right time, legally armed, and had done nothing to warrant Harriet's suspicion. When Harriet's turn came, her attorney spoke first. Miss Mansfield deeply regrets her actions. She was operating under an honest, albeit mistaken, belief of suspicious behavior. We plan to show there was no willful intent to file a false report. The judge looked unimpressed. Miss Mansfield, in your own words, please explain why you placed that 911 call on Ms. Owens. Harriet's voice trembled. She recited a prepared statement. Your Honor, I was frightened. I saw Ms. Owens acting in ways that I perceived as suspicious, and I panicked. I've since realized that my biases led me to make that call without real evidence. I am truly, deeply sorry for any harm or distress I caused. Judge Daniels was silent for a moment. Then she looked at Jasmine. Ms. Owens, do you wish to address the court at this stage? Jasmine rose, her gaze passing over Harriet. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to emphasize that Miss Mansfield's actions had real consequences. I was detained, humiliated, and it could have escalated. As a black woman, I am painfully aware that such baseless calls put lives at risk. I also want to note that I was on official government business, and Miss Mansfield's call impeded that work. However, I recognize that Miss Mansfield has taken some steps to apologize and acknowledge her bias. Jasmine paused, her posture regal. Still, I believe there's enough evidence to show that her call was made with reckless disregard for the truth. Harriet felt Jasmine's words like daggers. She wanted to shrink into herself, vanish. The judge listened intently, then asked the ADA whether the state intended to pursue charges. The ADA replied, "We do, Your Honor. We have witness statements from Starbucks patrons and officers on scene who confirm Miss Mansfield had no factual basis to suspect Ms. Owens. In the interest of public safety and deterrence, we believe it's important to hold Miss Mansfield accountable." Judge Daniels surveyed the room. Harriet caught the flicker of sympathy and sternness in the judge's dark eyes. "Miss Mansfield," Judge Daniels began, "racial profiling and misuse of emergency services are issues I take very seriously. However, I also see a measure of remorse. We will proceed to trial unless a plea agreement is reached. I'm setting a trial date in 6 weeks." A hush fell over the courtroom. Harriet's mouth went dry. A trial. This was real, not some fleeting embarrassment. She turned to her attorney in panic, who placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder but said nothing. Judge Daniels concluded, "I encourage the parties to discuss possible resolutions. Court is adjourned." As Jasmine and the ADA prepared to leave, Harriet felt an overwhelming urge to speak. She caught Jasmine's eye, silently pleading, but Jasmine looked away. Harriet was left with a swirl of dread, the echo of the gavel in her ears. Time moved quickly in the weeks before the trial. Harriet's attorney engaged in discussions with the district attorney's office, trying to negotiate a plea. Harriet found herself living a nightmare, constantly researching terms like criminal misdemeanor, racial profiling lawsuits, and false police report penalties. She knew she could face fines, probation, or even jail time. The worry weighed on her like an anvil. Meanwhile, Jasmine juggled the demands of her CIA mission and the pending legal case. The sting operation against the cartel-backed shell company was well underway. Jasmine had identified key players and was coordinating with local law enforcement to ensure a seamless bust. She should have been focused solely on that, but Harriet Mansfield's case ironically intruded on Jasmine's mental space. Jasmine had become a reluctant figure in the local news, known as the CIA agent racially profiled in Starbucks. Journalists requested interviews, but Jasmine declined, citing her position. Her name was out there, though, and Harriet's too, an unwelcome spotlight for both. At last, the trial day arrived. A swirl of news cameras were posted outside the courthouse, though the judge had barred filming inside. Harriet walked in wearing a modest navy dress, her hair pulled back. Jasmine entered with a quiet dignity, flanked by the ADA and, surprisingly, a representative from the Department of Justice who had an interest in the civil rights implications of the case. Tension crackled like static electricity in the air. Jury selection had been swift. Most prospective jurors recognized it as a case about racial bias. Some were eager to serve, some not. The final jury included a diverse mix of men and women, varying in age and race. Harriet's defense attorney, Richard Hale, did his best to weed out those he feared would judge Harriet too harshly from the outset. Once the trial began, the DA laid out the facts. Harriet's 911 call was based on prejudice, not evidence. Officer testimony confirmed Jasmine was calm, lawful, and had proper credentials for her firearm. Starbucks patrons reported Jasmine wasn't acting suspiciously. The baristas testified Jasmine was polite, exchanging casual remarks with staff. All of it painted a clear picture that Harriet's fears were self-constructed. Richard Hale tried a two-pronged defense. Harriet was genuinely mistaken and acting out of concern for public safety, and Harriet had shown remorse and was willing to accept responsibility. When Harriet took the stand, tears filled her eyes. She spoke about her upbringing, her father's influence, and how those biases had poisoned her judgment. The courtroom was silent as she described how it felt to watch Jasmine in handcuffs, only to discover Jasmine was a CIA agent. Harriet choked on her words, admitting she deserved to face the consequences. Finally, Jasmine testified. She recounted the day's events with clarity and composure. She emphasized the psychological toll of being publicly detained and the risk that such encounters pose to Black people, even more so to those without the privilege of official credentials. Jasmine avoided dramatics, but her sincerity resonated. One could hear the tension in the jury box as Jasmine described how Harriet's baseless call threatened Jasmine's safety and compromised her CIA mission in Atlanta. Then came the big twist. The Department of Justice representative asked to submit newly uncovered evidence, Harriet's call history, to 911. Although Harriet had made multiple calls over the years, there were half a dozen calls specifically reporting black individuals in her neighborhood for activities as trivial as waiting at a bus stop or talking on the phone outside. The pattern was stark. Harriet had never called 911 about a white person, even when some of her neighbors had loud parties or suspicious behavior at odd hours. This hammered home the point. Harriet's prejudice wasn't a one-time lapse. It was a pattern. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Harriet sank in her seat, tears streaming. She looked at Margaret in the gallery, who wore a sorrowful expression. Harriet's defense team argued that these older calls were irrelevant to the Starbucks incident, but the DA insisted it illustrated Harriet's predisposition to see black people as threats. Judge Daniels allowed the evidence, seeing it as indicative of Harriet's mindset. With that damning evidence, Harriet's attorney realized the best chance to mitigate punishment was to secure a plea deal. During a recess, urgent whispers flew between the DA, Harriet's team, and Jasmine. The negotiations were tense. In the end, Harriet agreed to plead guilty to the misdemeanor charge of filing a false report, pay a hefty fine, and complete a court-mandated anti-bias training program. Additionally, she would be on probation for 1 year. Had she gone to trial, she risked a worse fate. Harriet's formal admission of guilt in open court was tearful. She trembled as she said, "I plead guilty, Your Honor, and I accept full responsibility for my actions." Judge Daniels commended Jasmine for her professionalism and Harriet for recognizing the gravity of her mistake. The judge then sentenced Harriet according to the plea agreement, a $5,000 fine, a year's probation, and mandatory participation in a racial bias remediation program. As Harriet left the courtroom, she saw Jasmine in the hallway. Harriet mustered a faint, tearful nod. Jasmine acknowledged her with a distant look, not exactly forgiving, but seemingly at peace with the outcome. In the aftermath of the trial, Harriet's life changed drastically. She had never envisioned herself on probation in her golden years, but every week she had to check in with her probation officer, a young black man who treated her politely but firmly. She also enrolled in a racial bias remediation program. The sessions forced Harriet to confront her deep-rooted prejudices, question her father's teachings, and learn about systemic racism and implicit bias. Sitting in those classes, Harriet felt exposed, uncomfortable, and yet strangely enlightened. She began to recognize how her unexamined fear had twisted her worldview. It was humiliating to see herself as that person, but Harriet also felt a glimmer of hope that she could change. Financially, the $5,000 fine plus legal fees strained Harriet's budget. She had to sell some precious jewelry, including an heirloom brooch her grandmother had passed down. It stung, but Harriet felt it was cosmic justice for the harm she'd caused. Her circle of friends at the country club distanced themselves, fearing negative publicity. Harriet found herself more alone than ever. But in that solitude, she unearthed a possibility of growth she'd never considered. Meanwhile, Jasmine's sting operation against the cartel shell company wrapped up successfully. Thanks to the evidence she gathered, federal agents arrested several ringleaders, seizing millions in laundered money. Jasmine was hailed as a hero within her CIA circles, though she kept a low public profile. She was scheduled to receive a commendation back in Langley, which she accepted with the same quiet dignity she brought to every assignment. On her last day in Atlanta, Jasmine visited the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park. Standing at Dr. King's birthplace, Jasmine reflected on how far society had come and how far it still needed to go. She found a sober but steadfast resolve in remembering Dr. King's words, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Harriet's call at Starbucks was a personal injustice, but Jasmine saw it as part of a larger tapestry of racial bias that needed continued effort to dismantle. She would keep fighting that fight, both as an agent and as a black woman living in America. Before heading to the airport, Jasmine made one final gesture that took even her by surprise. She stopped by Harriet's home. Harriet, startled, opened the door, and there stood Jasmine in casual clothes, a rolling suitcase by her side. Tucker, Harriet's dog, yapped at her feet. "I'm leaving town," Jasmine said, "but I wanted to stop by, see how you're doing." Harriet, eyes brimming with tears, invited her in. The house felt strangely empty, without Harriet's usual sense of prim formality. They sat at the kitchen table, Harriet offering Jasmine a glass of sweet tea. Harriet began apologizing again, but Jasmine gently waved her off. "I hope you'll keep up with the bias program," Jasmine said quietly. "I'm not here to rehash the past. Just wanted to make sure you're going to be okay." Harriet clasped her hands, voice trembling with gratitude and shame. "I will be," she said. "I'm learning. It's painful but necessary, and I owe that to you." They exchanged a tentative, almost peaceful silence for a moment. The gulf that separated them seemed narrower. Jasmine sipped the sweet tea, then stood. "Take care, Harriet." She gave Tucker a small pat on the head and left, letting the door click softly behind her. Harriet sat alone in her kitchen, sweet tea untouched, tears slipping down her cheeks. It hurt to face the reality that she'd become an instrument of hate, but Jasmine's parting kindness sparked a faint sense of redemption. Harriet felt a renewed resolve to continue her classes, to open herself to communities she'd once feared. The price of her actions had been high, but Harriet now understood that true change doesn't come without real cost. Jasmine walked down the driveway, stepping into a waiting rideshare that would take her to Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. As the car pulled away, she exhaled, feeling a measure of closure. Life would move on, but neither woman would forget the twist of fate that brought them together. Harriet would forever carry the lesson that prejudice has dire consequences, and Jasmine, forging ahead on her path of service, would remain vigilant not just for foreign threats, but for the everyday injustices that can emerge in a simple coffee line on any ordinary morning. Sometimes justice takes a winding road to find its mark, but when it does, the impact is unforgettable. Harriet Mansfield learned the hard way that one phone call laced with fear and prejudice could unravel her world in a heartbeat. Meanwhile, Jasmine Owens demonstrated a level of strength and grace that challenged the very assumptions that sparked this chaotic encounter. In the end, a courtroom verdict delivered more than just legal consequences. It opened the door for Harriet to confront her own biases and begin the slow climb toward change. And for Jasmine, the ordeal served as a poignant reminder that vigilance against prejudice is part of the broader mission she's always upheld.